All right, hi everybody. My name is Sheldon Solomon, and I teach in the psychology department here at Skidmore College. And of course, I wish that we were all here together at the college, but this will have to do for today. And I have what I usually think is the most fun part of Accepted Candidates Days, and that's just to give you a little taste of what academic discourse is like here at the college. I've been here for 40 years teaching introductory psychology and personality theory, evolutionary psychology, existential psychology for the psychology department. And I've also been very delighted to be part of the First-Year Scribner Seminar program. And whenever I can, I teach in a course called Human Dilemmas. And that's what I'd like to do today, is to just give you a little piece of a presentation from the first-year seminar, Human Dilemmas, and the part of the course where we consider human identity. And very simply, that's just, well, how come I'm like me and you're like you? In psychology these days, we call that the study of the self. And if you look in textbooks, you'll see a little fortune cookie-like phrase. It'll say, the self is a biosocial psychological construction. And there's 2 points that we like to make about that phrase. Point number one is the biosocial psychological part. And the idea here is that if you want to understand about yourself, you need to think about the self in terms of biology, in terms of sociology, and also in terms of psychological aspects of selfhood. And then there's that other word, construction, which of course all of you are familiar with, and that's just something that's built over time. And the idea here is that the kind of self that you now are is not the same as the one that you came into the world with, and hopefully not the one that you'll have as the years go by. And part of what we want to talk about today is the extent to which we are each, at least at our best, able to participate in what I would consider to be the ultimate human prerogative, and that's to have a role in the construction of our own selves. All right, so let's start with biology. And let's note that if you are all here with me today, I would ask you, the students, to look at your parents sitting next to you and to begrudgingly admit that you look a little bit like them. And as all of you know, that's because we come into the world with inherited characteristics by virtue of genetics that determine the kind of carcass in which we currently reside. And that in turn establishes boundaries, both limitations as well as opportunities of the kind of self that we may become. To be silly but not, I'm about 5'8" tall, and so I'm not going to be a center on a professional basketball team. I'm not tall enough. I'm not going to give birth to children because I don't have ovaries. Stevie Wonder, a great musician, but he's never going to be a good diamond cutter or air traffic controller. And so sometimes our inherited physical attributes are limitations. Other times, though, they can be opportunities. Stevie Wonder, maybe not a great diamond cutter, but a fantastic musician, perhaps because he came into the world with perfect pitch, the ability to hear a sound and to know what note it is. But it's not only our physical characteristics that are inherited through genetics. There's also a boatload of psychological characteristics, and we know this from amazing studies of identical twins, where the twins are separated at birth and reared in very different parts of the world. And the idea here is when you locate the twins and when you study them, to the extent that they're similar, we have to assume that those similarities are because of common genetic factors. And so we know from those studies, for example, that intelligence, whatever that is in part genetically determined. Whether or not you're going to be schizophrenic, whether or not you're going to have bipolar mood disorder, unipolar depression, some kinds of binge drinking, also, at least in part, genetically determined. Sexual orientation, whether you're religious or not, in part genetically determined. Here's another one that may surprise you, your political orientation. You know how some people are very conservative, other folks very liberal, and that to a degree is determined genetically. And a couple of others that are receiving a lot of attention these days in psychological discourse. One is introversion, extroversion. Some people very happy to be to themselves. They're not lonely, they're not miserable, they're just introverted. Other people, very gregarious and outgoing. And this, too, appears to be in part genetically determined. Finally, what they call temperament, which is just our proneness to anxiety. And some people, very comfortable, very relaxed. My father's side of the family, completely mellow. My joke is that we could be sitting in a car in California and a tsunami could be coming in. And my father's side of the family would be like, oh, that's fine, we'll just sit here and get the car washed, no worries. On the other hand, my mom's side of the family, they were the really anxious, twitching blobs of biological protoplasm cowering under their chairs, just groping for sedatives the size of sport utility vehicles. We could be driving up on the turnpike, and my mom would see that the gas gauge was getting to half full, and she'd be like, oh, God, stop the car. We got to get some gas. And I'd be like, Mom, we just passed the sign. We got a rest stop in a couple of miles. No worries. But the point is that where you fall along that dimension is also in part genetically determined. So the take-home message here is that biology establishes boundaries. Let's leave it at that. It is limitations as well as opportunities, but there's got to be more to it, because when we look at identical twins, they are similar, but they're not identical. If they were identical, there'd be nothing else to talk about. It would all be genetics. But we now have to think about other factors that contribute to selfhood. And interestingly, the next one that we got to think about is sociology, or what's the effect of our social surroundings. And interestingly, the people that first noticed this were in the 1800s, and they just said, wow, if you ask most people, well, are you aware of the fact that you exist? So if you were here today, I'd be looking at you and I'd be like, hey, I don't want to be annoying, but raise your hand if you're listening to me now or pretending to do so while you hallucinate about our upcoming lunch. And all of you would raise your hand. You'd be like, of course I know that I'm here. And then I would say, hey, raise your hand if you remember when you were born. And nobody would raise their hand. I'd be like, raise your hand if you remember anything in your first year. Raise your hand if you remember anything in your second year. And a couple people do. Third year, fourth year, fifth year. I grew up in New Jersey. Around my 17th year, I vaguely began to realize that I exist. But the point here is that you're literally physically here before yourself is. You all admitted that you know you're here now, but nobody remembers actually being born. And what the sociologists tell us is that that's the result of a really interesting and uniquely human developmental process, and that is that we're born much more profoundly immature and dependent than all other creatures. So you have a fish gives babies, the fish just swim away. A cat has a kitten, and 6 weeks later, the kitten is on its way. Human infant, unable to do anything for many years. You can't live on your own for 8 or 10 years as a human infant, 30 to 40 years as an American infant. And the reason is that we're born immature. That's the price that we pay for our vast intelligence. We get born with only a chunk of our brain there, and the rest of it develops over time after birth in response to our experiences. That's why we're so fantastically creative and intelligent, but that also has profound implications for the way that the self develops. And the sociologists call this the looking glass self, And their point is that the self develops from the outside in. All right, the argument's very simple. We've already established that when you're born, you don't even know that you're here. But you do know that other people are here. In fact, little babies recognize their parents really almost immediately after birth. They don't see that well, but they can smell fine and they can hear very well. And what the sociologists tell us is that we come to know ourselves, therefore, as a reflection of the way the people around us come to know us. Therefore, by the time you wake up one day when you're 3 or 4 or 5, and you suddenly realize that you exist, a good chunk of your identity has been assimilated from your social surroundings, although you have no idea whatsoever that that has occurred. All right, that's kind of an obscure point, so let me give you the most common example in psychology, and that's your name. Of course, everybody has a name, and there's a whole social psychology of names. We tend to really take our names very seriously. There's a thing called the cocktail party phenomenon, and it's just an anecdote, but you're in a big room and everybody's talking. There's 50 or 100 people. You can't hear anything, but then somebody across the room says your name. And you hear that plenty well, and like an auditory thunderbolt, you kind of slither over like a reptile to hear what they're saying about you. Well, the point is that our name is so significant that it might be tempting to think that it has something intrinsically to do with us. But you know that's not true. Your name's an arbitrary, symbolic, linguistic affectation foisted upon you by your often malicious parents so they can have something to refer to you by. So my parents named me Sheldon, which I didn't care for at first, but they didn't need to do that. They could have called me iPad or Linguini, and I might not have liked that, and yet I would have gotten used to it. Over time, people call me Sheldon, 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 and all of a sudden, when somebody calls me that now, I'm like, yeah, that kind of feels right. There's a certain Sheldonosity to this pulsating piece of biological protoplasm that I now associate with myself. But it didn't come from me. It came from my social surroundings. And two implications here. And if we had more time and if we were on campus and we were doing this in a class, we would discuss this at length. But in passing, implication number one is that if your self is in part socially constructed, if it develops a bit from the outside in, well, that means you'd be a radically different person if you were gestated and reared in a very different time and place. And the other implication, and this is going to get us from sociology to psychology, is the fact that the self develops from the outside in has really profound consequences for the way that we acquire and maintain self-esteem. Here's another moment where I wish we had a little bit more time. On the one hand, everybody has heard the term self-esteem. It's the most common word in psychological discourse. On the other hand, it's really kind of ambiguous in common discourse because we routinely confuse and conflate self-esteem with pathological narcissism. And the point that I want to make, and again, I wish I had more time to expand on this idea, is that self-esteem, all things being equal, is the most important psychological attribute that you could have at your disposal. People that have genuine self-regard are not only psychologically better off, they're also physically better off. On the other hand, pathological narcissism, these are people who are, I'm the best, and you're not. When you're a legend in your own mind, that's not genuine self-regard. That's actually a spectacular absence of self-esteem that masquerades with a veneer of self-confidence in order to cover up heightened insecurity. All right, let's just stick with the real deal, genuine self-esteem. And let's think about how we get and how we keep getting it over the course of our lifetime. So let's start with babyhood. And let's note that until 5 or 6 years old, we know that kids get most of their self-esteem from their parents. Until about that age, you can predict a child's self-esteem by asking them about the extent to which they perceive that their parents love and accept them. All right, well, this is, I hope, a fairly obvious point. You don't need a PhD in psychology to recognize this. But the point here is that self-esteem is something that you need for yourself. But note from very early on, it's not something that you get directly for yourself and from yourself. Rather, you get your self-esteem by perceiving that you're satisfying somebody else's expectations of you. All right, fast forward a little bit, you get into grade school, and now the locus of self-worth changes a little bit because we not only get self-esteem from our parents, we also get it from our teachers. I hope everybody has a favorite teacher that brought the best out in you and that you still hold in high regard, and rightfully so. All right, note that you have shifted where self-esteem comes from. This is not to say your parents are irrelevant. That's not till middle school or so. But early on, we shift from our parents to our teachers. You also know this. Then you start to make friends. And for the bulk of your life thereafter, at least your adolescent and young adult life, well, now we get self-regard by perceiving ourselves as being held in high regard by those around them. All right, and so back in the old days when I was in college, we used to have really long hair, and we used to dress in clothes that we bought at Goodwill, and we had sideburns that were down to our shoulders, and I would go home for holidays, and my mom would be like, "Oh, you are an abomination. You look like the illegitimate offspring of Charles Manson having a relationship with Jesus, and it's just not a good look." And yet, that didn't bother me because I was more concerned about what my peers thought. And of course, this is no different today. The Skidmore students are great, and they're always giving me a hard time. They're like, "Dude, look at you. You're an abomination. Didn't anybody tell you that the 1960s are over? You should get some like real pants and maybe a shirt with a collar. When are they going to put you in the jar of formaldehyde in front of the Woodstock Museum?" And I say to them, I'm like, "Look, don't call me dude, call me Dr. Dude, show some respect." And then I say, "But yeah, all right, I'm a little disheveled, but look at you guys. I never saw this before where your hair is like a different length on one side than it is on the other. And I've never seen that color of yellow or pink on somebody's hair. When did Skittles start making hair dye?" And then when you open your mouth, when you came in my office last week and the sun was shining on that lug nut in your tongue, I was like, "Wow, what size wrench do you need to get through airport security?" And then we had one warm day before we had to scatter prior to spring break, and everybody's laying out on the case green, and a lot of the youth have tattoos, and they're lovely and beautiful. And I was looking at somebody's butterfly tattoo, thinking to myself, "Oh, come on back for your 40th reunion when that's going to look like a topographical map of Nebraska." We can laugh and be silly about this, but my point is that every generation, when they get to about your age, people go to great lengths to try and establish their own identity, somewhat ironically by just looking around and doing what everybody else around them is doing. All right, now, that continues for a bit, and maybe for your whole life, depending upon what you do in response to what the psychohistorian Erik Erikson called an identity crisis. Erikson said that in all times and places, there comes a point between adolescence and adulthood where, whether we're aware of it or not, we make a decision. And some of us choose not to choose, and that's our choice. And Erikson thought that, and the choice is very simple. It's, do I keep doing what I have been all my life, and that's to derive self-esteem by satisfying somebody else's standards, or do I use my rapidly developing cognitive and emotional and intuitive faculties to think about who it is and what it is that I want to be, and start developing my own standards by which I derive a sense of meaning and value. One of my favorite authors of yesteryear, a guy named Henry Miller, I like how he writes about it when he says, you know, the biggest joy that we get as human beings is to make of ourselves into a work of art. And I kind of like that. All right, so we've got this psychological fork in the road. Either we become a culturally constructed meat puppet by continuing to rather mindlessly measure ourselves by other people's standards, or we go in the direction of what the existential psychologists these days call authentic living. We make conscious and explicit decisions about how we would like our life to be. Right now, what Erikson did for the rest of his life was to study what happens to people depending upon which direction they go in response to this identity crisis, which, by the way, Erikson thought in Americans usually occurred between high school and college. And he argued that for many of us, it is when we start college that that's the first time that we have enough distance, psychological distance and physical distance from our friends and family so that we could distinguish who we want to be from who other people want us to become. All right, well, what Erikson says, and we're only going to do a little classic comic book overview of these ideas, is that one's life is very different depending upon how you resolve the identity crisis. And let's compare the culturally constructed meat puppet and the authentic individual along three dimensions. First, let's talk about conformity versus creativity. What Erikson tells us is that if you measure yourself entirely in terms of what other people think, you are going to be much more concerned about conforming to their expectations, and that will make it very unlikely that you'll ever be able to do anything creative, because to be creative, after all, requires that you repudiate the status quo. If you were happy with the way that things were, there would be no impetus to create. And so it takes a little bit of genuine self-confidence in order to be truly creative. Right, then Erikson makes a distinction between prejudice and tolerance. He points out that the culturally constructed meat puppet, because they get all of their affection and self-regard from other people, really clings tenaciously and anxiously to their culture's belief system, to the point where they tend to hate and hurt anybody who doesn't share their beliefs. On the other hand, the authentic individual is very much committed to their beliefs and their principles, but they never arrogantly assume that there are the all-encompassing repositories of wisdom that have the lock on the truth, and they're therefore always willing to admit that other people have a right to their beliefs and that we should respectfully embrace difference, even if we choose to maintain our own beliefs and our own behaviors. All right, finally, Erikson makes a distinction at the end of our lives between what he calls despair and ego integrity. So now we fast forward decades, hopefully a lot of decades for the youth, to when you're getting at the end of your life. And life doesn't end all that well for the meat puppet. When Erikson interviews those folks, what he finds is that as they get older, they say that life doesn't have any meaning. When he asks them about dying, they're very afraid and they're very angry at the prospect that they have to die. And when he asks them, well, if you could come back again, who would you like to be? they always want to be somebody different. I want to be Cleopatra, or I want to be Napoleon, or LeBron James, or Lady Gaga. Right, well, on the other side of the psychological ledger, what he calls ego integrity, life is a lot different as those folks get older. The older they get, the more meaningful life becomes. If you ask them if you could come back, who would you like to be? They look at you like you're a zombie, and they're like, well, what are you talking about? Of course I would like to be me. It's not that I didn't make mistakes. It's not that I might not have done this thing a little bit different than that thing, but if I got another round on the merry-go-round of life, I'd want to be riding the same horse that I did for this one. And then when you ask those folks, well, what about dying? They say, yeah, I'm apprehensive about dying. You can't really practice. Nobody's come back to tell us what it's like. And yet, I accept the fact that my life is finite as a perfectly reasonable price to pay for the joy of having been alive in the first place. And I like the last line of Erickson's most famous book. It's called The 8 Stages of Man. I hope if he wrote it now in this millennium, he'd include both halves of the human race. But be that as it may, what he says is if parents have the courage to die, their children will have the faith to live. And I love that. I think this puts everything in perspective because here you are, getting out of high school, getting ready to start college, and it's hard to think about what may be happening 60 years from now. And yet, if Erickson is right, the choices that you're about to make or choosing not to make are going to have a profound consequence on the rest of your life, but it will also have a consequential effect on the people that come afterwards. It's going to influence your children's lives and their children's lives, and hopefully for generations to come. It is a tremendous responsibility, but also a remarkable opportunity. All right, so that's kind of about it. If we had more time, I could blubber. Academics can talk endlessly, of course. I hope this has given you a little bit of a taste of what a class might be like here at Skidmore. And let me leave you with just a few thoughts. One thought is that I wish you all well in general. These are indeed unique times, historically unprecedented times. Life always comes before school, in my opinion. So I hope you're taking care of yourselves. I hope you're taking care of each other. I hope you're staying informed and staying involved. All right, secondly, with regard to choosing colleges, this is tough under any circumstance, and probably a whole lot tougher now where you have to make important life decisions confined to your house. I would say the same thing, though, if you were here in front of me, and that is that what I've learned from 40 years of teaching and lecturing in over 200 colleges and universities is that there's a lot of great schools. And I urge you to ignore the lists of best colleges and universities and think about what you think is best for you. What do you think in your gut? Because chances are that's going to be the best decision. And my sincere hope is that at least some of you in your gut are going to feel that Skidmore might be the best place for you. And in that case, we very much look forward to seeing you in the fall. And then finally, I hope you all feel free, whether you're coming to Skidmore or not, to contact me directly if you've got any questions about Skidmore, the first-year program, the psychology department, or psychology in general. I'm Sheldon Solomon at the psychology department at Skidmore, ssolomon@skidmore.edu. Have a great day, and it was a pleasure to talk to you, and it would have been better if I could have talked with you. Thanks a lot.